Thank you, Joe. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Wow. Thanks for the introduction, Joe. Actually, also thanks for giving me my very first speaking engagement at WinWriters in 2000. So in Seattle, but no less. So I'm really glad to be back. Really excited to be here and honored to speak in this conference and part of this great stellar lineup that you have going. Welcome to the Seattle Central Public Library. It's a fantastic venue. I think definitely a place to do more of these talks. So if you're here though for preschool story time or computer basics, this is not the talk. That is elsewhere. Actually, Elliot Graf from Microsoft forwarded me this. He said, I couldn't find your session on the public library schedule, but although I did find one thing quite interesting, which is the notion that to start with a computer, you need practice with a mouse and keyboard, and by no means to rag on the library. But it is interesting now with all the devices that we have that is not necessarily the case anymore. I mean, you have Surface, we have a Chromebook, Pixel, I brought one. These are touch devices, touch and keyboard. Of course, all the mobile devices, tablets and phones. So that's becoming, of course, they'll be around for a long time, but not necessarily forever. Great, so a quick introduction. Joe pretty much summed it all up, so I'm not going to bore you with the details. I'm a bit of an HTML5 enthusiast, or nut, you might say. That's my license plate. I should have washed my car when Guy Kawasaki drove by and took a nice picture. Right, so you can follow me on Twitter @PeterLubbers. Also, if you tweet, we have ConveyUX as the hashtag for the whole conference. So, all right, so without further ado, so we only have about 40 minutes, 45 minutes to talk. Do we still have that much time? Yeah, okay. Or did it come out of my budget? So there's a lot going on in HTML5. And any of these areas, and this is not even half of it, could be a 40-minute talk. So I'm going to do a lot of, not too many, I mean, there will be slides, but mostly demos, showing you some of these cool features. I'll be around after the talk, so if there's anything specific that you say, well, I didn't quite get how you did that, or I'm not going to dig into the deep guts of the code behind some of these things in here, but happy to talk more about that and have a lot of resources. And I'll make these slides available, obviously, so you can look at the demos in more detail. So before we dive into HTML5, how many of you are working with HTML5 on a daily basis or quite frequently? Okay, so a good number. So it helps to maybe take one step back and say, what exactly is HTML5? And there's different definitions of HTML5. Some people like to be very focused on exactly what's in the spec, the W3C and the what working group specs. Other people like to paint a little broader picture. So often you'll find HTML5 as a sort of catch-all umbrella term for new and exciting features on the web. That's more the camp that I'm in, because I don't think it helps very much to be so specific. That's great if you're a spec author or if you're working with specific details. We all know that CSS is not part of the HTML spec, yet you do need CSS, HTML, and JavaScript for building a modern web application. So HTML5 as that sort of umbrella term, as we'll talk about, has a lot of different feature areas. And there are things like the markup, there's offline and storage, there's real-time communication, media, there's CSS3, there's integration and performance aspects to it. So all of these have received a cryptic little icon, as you'll see here. You don't need to memorize these, but also device access. It's sort of an explosion of new features, something that really started in 2004, but it took several years before that to actually materialize in browsers, and now it's really a lot of that early wave of new features, things like the semantic markup, a lot of the communication APIs and storage. That's all in most modern browsers today, and that's really exciting. So it's a great time to be in web design, web development today. So I've picked the areas that I've found most to have the most impact on the user experience, the user experience you're building, whether that be a website, a web application, or in some way related to the web. There are a couple of features that are already landed and some that are going to land pretty soon that will make a big impact, and it's definitely taking your web experiences from the static, sort of static web page to a very rich, immersive experience, or it can be, and I'll try to share some demos of that. But before we do, kind of a good idea to also be realistic and see, well, okay, in which browsers does all of this cool stuff work? And there are a couple of great resources. One is called Can I Use, so caniuse.com is a great site where you can say, okay, I want to use WebSocket. Which browser support it? And you'll get an exact big table, including the mobile browsers. And another site that some of us are really passionate about, we've been working on this for a while now, is called Web Platform Docs, webplatform.org. How many of you have heard of webplatform.org? Okay, not so many. So definitely check it out. It's a cross-browser, even beyond effort. It's you can go there with it's webplatform.org. Docs.webplatform.org has all of the documentation of all the things, sort of the canonical reference site for web developers. It's in alpha state right now, so it's not completely finished, but it's a wiki. What's really cool about that is everyone can create an account, and within a few minutes you can be editing the documentation. So think of, for example, MDN or MSDN, HTML5 Rocks, all of these sites that different browser vendors had by themselves, and all now teaming up, so all the major browser vendors, Nokia, Facebook, Adobe, HP, all of them got together and said, let's build one site where this is located, and it's something that can be edited and really be improved as a whole. So we actually have technical writers at Google primarily working on editing documents here, or first creating documents on web platforms. So it's a really exciting site. Definitely urge you to check it out. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about markup and forms, and that's an area that has actually a lot of, that's very solid. You can actually use it as far back as IE6 with a couple of minor tweaks to your HTML. This is something you can really use today. And one of the core design principles of HTML5 is to, as they say, pave the cow paths. That means that if everybody is doing and designing and developing certain things sort of the hard way, then why don't we just give them the easy way? So an example would be, well, let me just give you this example here. In the past, everyone was creating sections of their pages using div elements, and then they would give it a header class. So at a certain point, people from Opera and people from Google started doing searches and figuring out how many people were actually using a header ID or class to style up a header. And guess what? That was a lot of people. And it's like, well, why don't we just create a header element? Simple. And it's the same for an aside and articles and sections and so on. And there's a whole bunch of these new elements, and that's not something really new, but what is exciting is the adoption. And this is some data that you're one of the first to see that. We're actually just starting to now share some of the HTML5 element adoption based on the Google search index. So we're seeing a pretty good uptake of these elements. I mean, there's lots and lots of sites that are starting to use things like the header and footer. So it's a promising sign that people are actually slowly starting to adopt this content. And of course, keep in mind that this doesn't reach behind like login sites. So this is basically just on the public internet. So it's really cool to see something that really, a few years ago, it was just an idea, and it's now becoming a reality. Another example of paving the cow paths is, for example, different input type, different form inputs. Well, you may have an email address, and everybody has that on their site. Enter your email address or enter your birth date. So in the past, you would have this code. It was a text input. And then you write in JavaScript this super complex regular expression to actually check whether that field, that the input that they've entered, is in fact a valid email address. So that's complicated, right? But everybody is doing that. So now HTML5, so basically scratch that top one, and all you need to do in HTML5 is an example of how simplified the markup is. And somebody just before the conference, the session started, said, well, I'm really familiar with HTML4. How hard is it to get into HTML5? I'm actually, in many cases, it's a lot simpler. Now you just say form, input, type equals email, and that's it. In fact, you can even, in your CSS, style things. So if you see the bottom, the CSS declarations there, I can say foo bar. See, now this is a valid email address, and it becomes green. I'm not sure how well that displays on the screen, but you can see that. Again, you're not constantly in JavaScript polling the page, checking to see every character that gets typed in. This is handed directly into the browser. So there's nothing left to do except that's the style I want, and that's the type of input I want. One thing that happens, though, is if a browser does not support these new input types, they will fall back to the default input type, which is always text. So it's actually, you're not going to have a loss of features, but it'll not be as nice. In fact, this presentation is completely written, actually, this little section here, that's what you just saw, and I can just change this to color, refresh the page. Now I have a color picker, right? So this is all part of HTML5, very easy to use. I can type it to range, and now I have color and a range. Now, here, so I have an email address that I can slide around. Right, but you get the point. It's a simplification. It's paving those cow paths is a real good example of HTML5. And the nice thing what you get with these email or these different inputs, not just email, is a mobile device may give you a virtual keyboard. Now I have the @ sign there. I don't have to toggle multiple levels deep in text. Also, one thing I didn't show you, let me just go back one slide. And I'll have to fix this again. So one thing that you see here, if I type in foo, and the browser gives me this natively as a sort of built-in widget, if you will, said, please enter a valid email address. But that message is actually translated in all different languages that this browser is translated in. So I don't need to do any of that work. So it's like benefits across the board with this kind of simplification. Okay, so we have that, the mobile support, the translations, and all of that. And again, you can see the percentages here are different. They're not the same levels of percentages, but for email, it's really picking up. We're also planning to make the other inputs available over time. So we're doing some periodic reviews of how many people are using these things, and we're seeing some pretty good adoption. And we're going to share that from the Chrome developers Google+ page. Another really cool example, one of my personal favorites, is this details element. Here's a details element. So here, if you click it, it expands and contracts. So very simple stuff. You can see that in the HTML code, I mean, you don't have to be hardcore HTML wizard to write this kind of stuff. It's very, very simple code. You can put in a ton of information in that sort of the hidden section and only make it appear when you need it. So that, I love this for documentation projects. In fact, I used it in the previous company I worked at called Kaazing. We had a setup guide, and actually this recently won an STC award of merit for use of this concept. Like we have things like, how do I unpack a zip file? Well, 99% of your users is going to be completely familiar with unzipping a file. But just for those couple of people that don't, then I have all this information that I want to give people, but I don't want to clutter up my simple 6-step installation process. So this is, you see it slightly different. Different representation here. You have a very simple styling, but in CSS you can access, as you can see here, when the details are open, I give it a border, all of those kinds of things you can easily attach and make it very pretty. Okay. Now another element, and this is something you may not have heard of yet, this is pretty much, this is brand new, and this only landed in Chrome Canary like a week or so ago. This is a template element. What's really cool about template elements is it's part of sort of the larger picture of what we call web components. A template element is an element that you can reuse later as, you know, as a template, as the name implies. But what's nice is you can define, for example, images. Here you can see an image, the source is not set to anything. Typically, if you have something like that in your HTML code, this would error out, right? You would get a 404 not found, this particular, or well, in this case, no image. A template works differently. The browser will parse that, but it will sort of keep it there for later. And then with a few lines of JavaScript, you can append these templates to your running code. And what's really cool about that is that, let's see here, I'll show you an example of it. So here is that example in action. This is on HTML5 Rocks, a great article about templates by Eric Beidelman. You can, of course, this is fairly simple, but as you insert these, you can insert the name or the image with the right reference in it. So it's a pretty cool new concept to build reusable objects in your code and literally just put them in your template. You can use HTML and CSS styling and reuse it later. So it's basically parsed but not executed. So scripts are not run until you really need that. So quite a cool feature, and this just landed. I'm actually demoing it here in Chrome Canary because it wasn't working in the other build yet. So, okay. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about other parts. So that was sort of the core markup and forms. HTML5 also defines a rich set of graphics that you can use for enhancing your experiences. Now here's one that you may have seen. It's what we call a Chrome experiment. Let me just put this in here. This is using WebGL, so it's basically a complete mapping of the solar system. So it's not just fun, because it's also pretty educational. And here you have, so you can sort of zoom into this galaxy here, and then you get information about specific stars. So as opposed to reading this in, let's say, a Wikipedia article or in just straight text, you have now this very immersive experience, and you can keep zooming in. So things like that are now becoming possible in using the different types of what we call canvas. So there's a two-dimensional canvas as well as a three-dimensional canvas using the WebGL. And then this, you can see you can tilt these sideways as well in your browser. So this is all done in HTML5 without any plugins, right? So that's the big benefit here, is not that this wasn't possible before, but this might not have been possible using just standard web technologies. Okay. Here's one that I personally enjoy quite a bit. Is you can take with HTML5, there's several device access APIs. And these device access APIs allow you to get access to your geolocation coordinates, or they might give you camera access or microphone access. In this case, I'm taking the camera access, the stream from the camera, the get user media that is called, so I can take the input from the camera and actually push it into a canvas. Now in canvas, in a two-dimensional canvas, you actually have complete pixel level control. You can get the RGB and A values for every single pixel. What's really cool about that is I can determine, where shapes are. Like I figure out the edges of a hand or a head, and I can detect faces and hands and so on, and then I can overlay that back on to the stream. So that's what's happening here. Let me show you. I get a little echo here. So. All right. So for camera access, clearly that's not something you want every website to just get whenever they want that. So the browsers will put a little privacy protection here and say, do you want this site to do that? And I'll allow that in this case. And now it will take the camera feed and it will detect my hand. So I'm not actually touching anything here. I'm actually able to play this xylophone just with my hands using Canvas, the get user media, and then taking all the data from the canvas very quickly and then overlaying it on the actual part you see and then playing sounds. So I can also hit it with my head. So pretty incredible experiences that are becoming possible. Also related to the get user media is WebRTC, effectively saying, get user media from me and push it over what is called a peer connection to another person, and now you have web conferencing effectively in the browser. And then you can do things like this and overlay drawings, create whiteboards. So the old static web pages are becoming a thing of the past. This is really pushing the limits of what's possible on the web. And a really good example, and I know a lot of you are also working on documentation projects, and this is a project I'm pretty excited about. It's called AnyWorks, and it's built by Gary Davis, and who happened to be in town, so he's here. In case you have any questions about this, chat with him afterwards, and I'm happy to talk more about it as well. It's really cool. It's currently sort of a proof of concept of what's possible in animation for documentation. And this was started, Gary worked for Cisco, and so you have a lot of these network diagrams. But you could imagine any other image here. It could be a children's story, just the same. And if a picture is worth 1,000 words, and an animated diagram like this might be worth as many frames as there are in that diagram. And so what's really cool is you can have this more interactive approach. This is all done in pure Canvas, so it's completely HTML5. Almost every browser today supports that. There's even polyfills, ways to make it work in older browsers as well. But what's really cool about this is, okay, so we've had that, that's nothing special, but I can actually go in edit mode now. So if I go in edit mode, and say, okay, I'm going to add myself a shiny firewall, edit the diagram. I'm going to go into this path mode, and I'm going to change this hacked packet. I'm going to change that to finish right here at the firewall. I'm going to play it again. So now I've actually edited it. Watch that the hacked packet actually stops at the firewall. It's inspected there, and it goes on. It doesn't really matter what the concept is here that you're trying to put across, but what's really cool is that the editing, the player, and the path experience is all done in pure HTML5. So if you wanted to add something like this to your documents, all you would need is basically some graphics, a JavaScript library, and and the sort of the JSON object that is created here. You could save this out in an edit mode and keep that. So really creating some incredible potential here for the user experiences you're after. Right. Now, a lot of native applications on, for example, Android and iPhone applications, they work just as well offline as they do online. And the web never really had that. Now, HTML5 defines something called application cache that will allow for those very great offline experiences. There are some sites like the Financial Times or offline Gmail that are actually using these features today to create web experiences that are on par with sort of the desktop and the mobile apps. Of course, you do need to be online to first load this page. You also need to be online to get new content. But it's better than getting that sort of page not found error when, when you're using this experience. You can still read a lot of the old stuff that you have. You can couple this with the HTML5 storage APIs and store articles and images and so on locally to use later. It's actually really, really simple to use this. A quick example, I'm not going to go to too much detail. All you need is a list of all your files that make up your web application, your website, and then you add that, the reference to that file, in a manifest attribute on the HTML element. So that's really all there is. The browsers, the modern browsers, will pick that up. They'll see that, oh, there's an app cache, a manifest there. It's going to load all those in your local cache. And then the next time you go to that site, it's pulling that directly out of your local cache. It will actually speed up your pages as well on top of that. So it's a nice benefit. I wrote a small demo. You can check out once you get these slides. It's on appcachefacts.info. That's where there's a nice little demo on how this works, and you can set up your browser without no files in the cache, and then try it out and play around with it. So I urge you to check that out. One thing, I wouldn't call that part of HTML5, but really kind of putting all the pieces together. Responsive design is very important. We're now working with laptops, mobile devices, iPads, tablets, and all of that. And a great example of responsive design, which tailors the content to your specific device, is the Boston Globe. You may have all seen that. It's a fantastic example of that in action, where you resize the page and it just scales to the content. A similar project we just started. So as you know, I wrote this book, Pro HTML5 Programming, and the publisher, Apress, really wanted to do something, especially because it was about HTML5 and CSS and all of these great things, but it was still just a book, a static print book. So they said, well, we really like to do something with that content. Can we practice what you're preaching in this book and actually turn it into an HTML5 experience? And so Jen Simmons and Chris O'Connor and Dylan Wooters at Apress, they got together and built this incredible experience to take that book content, the stuff you will find, actually let me take one step back, the stuff you'll find in the print version, the ebook version, but actually go a step further and make it interactive. And actually interesting to look at the sort of the history here. It actually started with this sort of, there's a library called Turn.js, which actually turns all your pages, all your content into a book. And while that was pretty good, it doesn't scale very well, right? So it's more like, okay, now you've turned an actual book into a web book. And yeah, that just wasn't quite there. And let's see here. The next step was we went to something called Tree Saver. Let's see if that's working. So still had the same idea. You have pages and you move around from page to page. It's more responsive though, so the content will scale. But at that point, it's like, well, why don't we just well, okay, that doesn't scale too well, but sorry. But at that point, it was more, why don't we just abandon this whole book concept? Like, we're building an HTML5 site. Like, let's give people what they really need to do. So this is the latest prototype. So again, this is a first for this conference. It hasn't been shown anywhere. The exact plans that Apress has, I can't really comment on quite yet, but this is something, sort of a general direction of making print content available in a much more interactive way. And so here's the book, the homepage. There's a little video that I recorded, and now you're in the book, and you can very quickly jump around. So let's say I go to the Canvas API chapter. You'll notice that if I were to go offline now, I won't do that for the demo, all of this content is there. In fact, I have the same content here on a Nexus 7. This Nexus 7, I showed it to a person here before. It has the same content. This Nexus 7 is not online. So it's using application cache to fetch all those resources, and then you can have the entire experience offline. This is great for when you're on the airplane and not every single tab on your browser errors out. So now I'm in this document, so I have this sort of responsive design. So let's take a look at that. So it scales to whatever form factor I may be using at the time, even an iPhone. Something very small that probably wouldn't be a great experience anyway. But one of the things that I can go here, work with paths, and one thing that I'm very excited about is this feature where we're actually using Canvas and a built-in JavaScript code editor to have interactive code examples. So you're in here, you're either on your tablet or on a device, and you can change here, you can change things and see them happening in real time. So you're actually taking that code and you're working with that. And all of that sort of packaged up in a nice book format. I think it's a pretty compelling use case, throwing all those concepts together. Of course, it's also using the HTML5 video and other things. Okay. Now, a new sort of era is coming with more and more touch devices. We've seen the Microsoft, the Surface tablet. Google just came out with the Chromebook. It's called the Pixel, which is a touch device, and I have one here. I'm not going to attempt to, during the middle of this presentation, switch to that one, but afterwards, definitely come up and you can see the same demos in action. So let's quickly going to go to this site, and I'll show you a couple of quick examples here.
This experiment shows switching between mouse and touch mode on a touchscreen laptop.
This is done by one of my colleagues, Boris Smus, who has written some really great articles on sort of like these new paradigms, right? He calls it responsive input, because you're now dealing with devices that have not only touch, not just like a tablet where you're just touching, but you're touching and you have a keyboard. And it's making some new kinds of experiences possible. So let me just let him explain that.
When I use the touchscreen, the buttons get bigger. When I switch to mouse, they get smaller.
So that's sort of a response to detecting that somebody's touching the screen. Okay, I've got that. Now, when you're in a touch mode, you're going to need larger buttons, right? You need to be able to, it's much less precise than the mouse. So you need to change that. So that he's built that example here, and I'll have a link to that as well. This is a good one.
This experiment shows adding markers to a map via the touchscreen and navigating the map by panning and zooming using the trackpad.
There's one more here. All right, this is pretty good.
In this experiment, I can manipulate an object on the screen by a combination of selection via the touchscreen and...
So here you can see a touch as well as two-finger swipe and one-finger swipe together, making for some really interesting possibilities for example, architectural drawings and stuff. You want to get in there and you want to control it a little bit more. So things like that are becoming
manipulation
possible
via the trackpad.
Okay.
One finger rotates the object and two fingers scales it.
So Microsoft's done some great work with pointer event specification. So there are some what we call polyfill libraries as well, pointer.js, and there's a few more happening right now that sort of merge a lot of these different events, the touch, the keyboard, everything together into a single unified way to interact. So that's some really good stuff on that. Here's a demo again on Boris's site that you can do. Of course, I can't really do that here. Well, I can do it with the mouse, but I can't do the multi-touch here. You would need an actual touch display for that. One quick way, though, for if you're interested, in the Chrome developer tools, we have a nice way to, it's called overrides. And you can actually emulate touch events with your, with the mouse, right? So you can at least get pretty close to what it would be like if you had touch. So you would then just get this experience. So pretty good idea that, you know, if you don't have a touch device, you can at least try it out. Okay. Another sort of approach to this sort of the touch input this is a pretty good one. It's a WebGL bookcase. And in the Google office in New York, we actually have like a complete display, like an actual huge touch screen or 3 huge touch screens that allow you to actually touch those, and then when you get the book you want, you can, so it'll take just a second to load up here. All right, so I might pick this. Here's a completely new way, and of course on a touch display it would work even better, but I might, you know, pick this Ubuntu 10.10 handbook, and now I can start reading it. There's a QR code that, so if you're on the touch window display, you can just scan that and it gets you into your reader. So really interesting ways of navigating this kind of large amount of content in a much more, in a much easier to digest way. Okay. And this is the picture of the New York office where we have this, where you can actually just spin it around by hand. It's pretty cool, and it's running on Chromebooks. Okay, so beyond touch, a couple of other things I want to point out, and then I'll talk briefly about some of the developer tools, and then I think we're running out of time. Yeah, right. So, okay, good. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to show that they're starting to land in browsers. This is pretty cutting edge, but it's still nice to know where things are going, because the things that were cutting edge 2 years ago are now commonplace. And so here's an example of something that Chris Wilson built. It's a great demo of what is called MIDI support. So he's working on a specification. It's called the Web MIDI. So if you have a MIDI device, for example, this sort of little DJ mixer board, and my son is a DJ, but I'm not, you can control that, so basically over USB into the browser, and I can control that here. And I can start the other one. You can do both, of course, but you don't need to. There. Oh, this one's still running. There. So really cool ways to get device access into your web experience. So you might imagine that maybe at some point this would be with a touch device. Of course, you could do all these things on here. That may not be the kind of experience that most professional DJs would want. They might still want this, but having this access to over MIDI directly to your browser, it sort of mitigates that whole point. So you can do both. Of course, you can try all this out on a touch device and it will work equally well, but it's still quite different from that very tactile feel. Now, speech input. This is something I'm really excited about. This is the kind of thing that we should have had years ago, but it's really happening right now. It's really something you can start using in browsers. This is Sure, not in all browsers yet, but the kind of thing where when you have web audio and you have audio input, and you can take that audio input and then do things like round trip it to a speech server that can detect what you're doing, that's really pretty exciting. So let me see if that works. Okay, I'm really excited to talk about HTML5 today. There. There. Actually, what's really good, I'm going to leave that to you to do, but it actually detects swear words, and it will actually start them out in real time. So I won't do that here, but it is quite, makes for a good demo too. Gamepad API, I didn't bring a PlayStation controller, but if you hook up a USB PlayStation or Xbox controller, and you play this Google Doodle, this is quite fun. You can, at this point I'm doing that with keyboard, I'm terrible at hurdles. See, it's even giving me tips. There, ah, yeah. So anyway, so I can just knock them all over. So this is where you need one of those game pads, right? So, and yeah. 25 seconds, so you can probably beat that with one hand. But the point is that all of these devices, this sort of device access, whether that be a gamepad or a MIDI device, all of this is very easy now to sort of integrate, and sort of the web experience of that becomes so much more, more fun. Okay, so you might wonder, what sort of tools are we, do we have to use for developing HTML5? And this is one of my favorite, this is my favorite robot dinosaur. His name is Fake Grimlock. I don't know if you know him. He's like a lean startup advisor sort of persona. What's really cool about, he's got some great quotes, but I like this one. If UX not code, no good at web. What I make out of that is, these days, the process of going from a design to a working website is quite different from what it used to be, or it can be. And with the dawn of these incredible developer tools, and if you haven't looked at these developer tools, you really owe it to yourself to take a closer look at that. I mentioned that, for example, this whole presentation is an HTML5 presentation. And so if you hit these shortcuts, in this case it's a Mac, Command-Option-I, then you open the Chrome developer tools. And this is the same shortcut for all the other browsers as well. They have, everyone has their own set of browser developer tools. And you see that there's a whole bunch of tabs, and for example here I can select my image. I can just grab it here. And then I can just add border and green. There. Now I've changed that page, right? Of course, it's not saved on the server, but it's actually quite easy if I go to the resources to set it up to where I can save locally. So I can actually develop in the browser. And more of the sort of prototyping and design can actually happen quite comfortably in the browser. And you can have a great view into all these different areas, even deeper, like the timeline and profiles. I won't get into detail here, but there's a lot of things you can do in those tools that gives you great insights and on-the-fly modifications that really make it a powerful experience. And one that I really like is this one. This is in Firefox. Let me just fire that up a second. So Firefox is a 3D model of any website. So I have this here. I do, again, same shortcut, Command-Option-I. And then I go into this 3D model view. And then this is using the WebGL that I talked about earlier. And let's see here. Oh yeah, here's the conference website. That's pretty cool, right? So it kind of fun. I've seen some websites that look more like the shape of the library. This one is very nicely organized. But go and try this out on sites like Facebook when you're logged in, or some very complex site and it's like massive. So it's not that it really means anything necessarily, but it's kind of fun to see this. And sometimes you see things sticking out, and it's like they point you at possible problems in your site that you wouldn't otherwise have seen. So a pretty cool view of the web world here. Okay. The final thing I wanted to mention, if you want to try some of these features, so in Chrome we have 3 channels. So there's the stable channel that you download if you get Chrome. There's a beta channel that you can sort of upgrade to, and a developer channel. They get more and more adventurous. Also something that I mentioned, or that I've seen shown side by side, Chrome Canary. So that's actually something that is like the most cutting edge thing, sort of a nightly build, if you will. That one can be installed side by side. So you can actually experiment with a lot of these things in a separate browser and leave your regular browser alone. So that's kind of nice. So you have that. And in all of those versions, there are experimental flags that you can turn on. If you go to Chrome://flags, you can turn these on. For example, the web MIDI or web audio, when it first is released, it's usually released behind a flag, something that's like, well, let's have people play around with it, but we don't just turn it on for everyone yet. So definitely check that out. If some of these features that I'm showing here aren't working, check it in a different version of the browser, and if that doesn't work, maybe there's a flag that you need to set. Sometimes that can really kind of trip you up. So, so I wanted to end it there. I have plenty of time for questions and all of that.
Just repeat the question.
Yes, sure. Just a couple of quick notes. San Francisco HTML5 user group. Definitely, we record all of our events. So even if you're in Seattle, you can still sign up and hear when all of our events. We have, like Joe said, every month an event. We have about 6,500 members now. It's really big. Google Developers Live. This is where we air a lot of our live shows. The book. We just launched a course on Udacity about HTML5 game programming, and that's it.